LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the April 5th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I'm wearing Pandemic Peach this week, I guess, and I've brought you the 16 best, most newsworthy clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for which would be a really educational, fair use, media criticism, and political comedy show for you all tonight. I have the clip list down in the video description. There's a link to my clip list if you want to follow along on my notes of my 16 clips, and you might not understand all the notes, but you'll probably figure out who's speaking in each of the clips and kind of what the topic is. And also down there, you can see my video description where I talk about what the topic is, or down in the video description, you can see my topic description where I mentioned that it's COVID-19 worst weeks, ? Because that's what the experts are saying. This week and next week may be the worst weeks in the United States for the pandemic. It's a prediction, it's not a fact, but that's the ? And one of the things that's definitely been developing this week is the Trump has all sorts of excuses for his poor, dishonest response to the coronavirus crisis since January, at least, of this year. And his latest response that takes away his responsibility seems to be blaming the states. And he also brought in his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to aid in that this week. And through his series of reality TV press conferences, he's pushing this idea all week. And I'm going to show 5 news summaries from all 5 of the big 5 corporate outlets. And then I'm also going to show you 3 different governors reacting to this new narrative that's coming from the White House. 1 Republican, Asa Hutchinson of Arkansas, and then 2 Democrats, J.B. Pritzker from Illinois, and then Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan. I also have a couple Trump administration health officials. There's the Surgeon General, Jerome. He's the one who says that this is like the worst week coming up, our Pearl Harbor, our 9/11 of the pandemic. You'll see that clip. You'll also see him saying that people should be wearing masks. You'll see a couple Anthony Fauci clips. And then at the end, I'll also have a couple Joe Biden clips where I think he did a better job this week showing how he can point out the flaws in Trump's response to this whole coronavirus crisis, which has been the topic for so many weeks now. And as for the political comedy, last week I did this. I showed you like an Andrew Cuomo dad joke where he talked about the nasal swabs not having to be so long, of course, and then he made a joke about his own long nose and how he still needs a long nasal swab. And I don't know if you think that there's any place for humor in the midst of so many people dying, but I think Trump definitely went way beyond that this week. Well, he makes these weird jokes all the time, and this is going to be in the end of the NBC News Meet the Press news summary I'm going to show you in a minute, but it's just one of the tasteless jokes from Donald Trump talking about modeling, how there's all this modeling involved in the coronavirus epidemic, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch. This is Trump's idea of humor in a pandemic over here.
Hundreds of thousands of people are going to die. You know what I want to do? I want to come way under the models. The professionals did the models. I was never involved in a model, but at least this kind of a model.
Yeah, he's been in models, not those kind of models, but he's been in models. That's what Trump thinks. I guess the guy just has no filter. It's pretty late in his presidency to make that insight, I guess. But there was a Bill Maher, Real Time with Bill Maher this week, which I decided not to take clips from. If I see something really good or some like really insightful humor, I've been watching a bunch of late night shows struggle with social distancing and the pandemic. But I don't know. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks. But now I want to show you 5 different news summaries from all 5 of the big 5 corporate outlets. And by far the best one, and this is often true, but especially this week, I think NBC News' Meet the Press had the best news summary. This is Chuck Todd. You'll see he does this introduction about a national reckoning on two things, one on the virus, but also on the response to the virus. And that's one of the things I've been measuring in these news summaries is how well that's one of the responsibilities of journalists is to show when people in power are making mistakes, and the Trump administration couldn't give the press more opportunities to do that. And you'll see a lot of accountability in this NBC News Meet the Press news summary. And this is also where I got that Jared Kushner picture, because you'll see holding the Trump administration accountable for this new narrative I was talking about, the states versus the feds, and what's the truth about that, and how the federal stockpile that, Jared Kushner got in trouble for saying that the federal stockpile of materials is our stockpile, not the state's stockpile. And who does he think the United States is made up of other than the states? And this is the only news summary that really made that point strongly, as I will discuss with you after we watch NBC News Meet the Press's best news summary of the 5, and then the 4 others that have some good points that I will also point out, but not as good as this one, which I will discuss with you after we watch together over here.
Sunday morning, the week began with 2 national reckonings on the coronavirus. The first is where we're headed. As of this morning, there are more than 300,000 confirmed cases in the United States and well over 8,000 deaths. The federal government is now acknowledging that in a best-case scenario, somewhere between 100,000 and 240,000 Americans are likely to die from this virus. One point of comparison, that's more Americans than died fighting in Korea and Vietnam combined. As you can see, the United States, that's the soaring red line in this graphic here, trails the world in flattening the pandemic's curve, perhaps the single most critical goal of all. Which brings us to the second reckoning, the government's performance. Like President Trump insisting for weeks that the coronavirus was no worse than the flu. Like the lack of testing, the big one, starting with the botched CDC test kits. Like the government's inadequate stockpile of ventilators, gowns, and other personal protective equipment. Like the mixed messaging on face masks, the CDC recommending them, the president refusing to wear one. Like disbanding the National Security Council's pandemic team in 2018. There are so many more, including one we're all responsible for, the failure to follow safety guidelines. Remember, those sobering death toll numbers hold only if everyone practices social distancing. And as we learned last week, that isn't happening everywhere. Still, the bottom line is the government has been telling us it's been in control of the virus, when in fact, it is the virus which has been in control of us.
We are afraid for our patients. We are afraid for our families. We are afraid for our lives.
In New York and around the country,
we are a small rural hospital. We have no ventilators.
Medical providers, first responders, and state officials are pleading with the federal government for more help.
Every state is saying the same thing. I need help. I need assistance.
But this week, the Trump administration repeatedly sent governors the message, don't look to us first.
The notion of the federal stockpile was it's supposed to be our stockpile. It's not supposed to be state stockpiles that they then use.
By Friday, the HHS website describing the national stockpile had been altered from saying it had enough supplies to respond to multiple large-scale emergencies simultaneously to reading its role is to supplement state and local supplies as a short-term buffer.
I don't know if Jared Kushner knows this, but it's called the United States of America. And the federal government, which has a stockpile, is supposed to be backstopping the states.
9 governors are still declining to enact stay-at-home orders, and Mr. Trump is refusing to direct them to do so, despite recommendations from his own public health officials.
I just don't understand why we're not doing that. We really should be.
The government's advice has changed over time. Americans were told not to wear masks. Now the CDC is recommending they wear non-surgical masks or face coverings in public. On Friday, the president immediately made it clear he is not going to follow that guidance.
You can do it. You don't have to do it. I'm choosing not to do it.
Americans were told only older people or those with compromised immune systems were at risk. In fact, 21% of deaths and nearly half of patients admitted to the ICU have been Americans under 65, according to early CDC data. Americans were told testing was widely available.
Anybody that needs a test gets a test. They're there.
Even now, there have been just 1.6 million tests conducted nationwide, a fraction of what experts say is needed. In fact, for months, the president played down the virus, misrepresenting the facts.
It's one person coming in from China, and we have it under control.
It looks like by April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away.
This week, he reversed course on his rosy projections, acknowledging the U.S. death toll could be staggering, while attempting to claim
100,000 is, according to modeling, a very low number. On the show, hundreds of thousands of people are going to die. You know what I want to do? I want to come way under the models. The professionals did the models. I was never involved in a model, but at least this kind of a model.
And like I said, the political comedy clip, what Trump thinks is political comedy, that I used was the very end of that Meet the Press news summary, which before I showed it, explained several ways it was really great. That it, I especially liked the way they showed the federal website scrubbing the description of what the federal stockpile is supposed to be used for, and saying, changing it to a backup for the states rather than what it actually in the statute that creates it says that it's supposed to be used by the states, not a backup for the states. And it's just one of the many dishonest, bad government responses from the Trump administration that I will be discussing over and over again throughout this broadcast. And one of the reasons I think that Meet the Press news summary was so good is because it spent a significant amount of time, even while we're talking about what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future, we also have to look at why we got here with, and there were multiple, not just the model snippet there, but there were multiple snippets from the news conferences that let us know that we have a president who is doing these daily news conferences that if you watch them in full, like I do every day, there's something wrong with this guy. His ability to empathize with the plight of other people. Everything he does seems to be to, what helps Donald Trump. That is always like his guiding light. His, malignant narcissism. Could you have any better evidence than watching the daily press conferences? You can let me know what you think down in the comments section. I've actually been reading the live comments along the way, and I did see a couple super chat contributions from Sexy Bob and Lulu Girl about this being Sexy Bob's birthday, which I did not know, although one of the reasons I was delayed this week is because today is also my mom's birthday, so happy birthday to Sexy Bob and to my mom if she happens to watch this show. I don't think Sexy Bob is as old as my mother is, but I guess it's a good day to be born. I actually had a birthday about a little over a week ago in March. I also had a birthday, and it's not fun to have a birthday during the pandemic. You can't go out to dinner. You basically can't do anything if you're in a stay-at-home state, and all the states should be stay-at-home states. We're actually up to about 90% stay-at-home order in the United States, but there's still, you saw in that NBC News Meet the Press news summary, that there are still some places where you don't have to stay at home, including Arkansas, and I'm going to show a clip of Asa Hutchinson talking about that. That will be clip number... Asa Hutchinson is also on NBC News' Meet the Press, and that will be clip number 9. But I have 4 more news summaries to show you, and I think what I liked most about the CNN State of the Union news summary, Jake Tapper always tells us what the State of the Union this week is, bracing ourselves for what might be the worst weeks coming up. But what I really like about this news summary, which wasn't in the Meet the Press news summary, is this thing that the Trump administration did late on Friday night in the middle of a pandemic. So, they're supposed to be, they're trying to hide it from anyone noticing. And it was the firing of the Inspector General for the intelligence community, Michael Atkinson, the one who brought the whistleblower complaint over to Congress, even though the Justice Department told him not to. And it just shows that there's all these, what the Trump administration values the most is not competence, it's loyalty. And that's one of the reasons we're in the big mess we're in. And that is briefly covered in Jake Tapper's news summary on CNN's State of the Union this morning in this clip.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the State of our Union is bracing ourselves. Today marks the beginning of what President Trump says may be the toughest 2 weeks of the coronavirus pandemic in the United States. Announcing in a press conference Saturday there will be, quote, a lot of death. It is hard to fathom since the numbers are already so overwhelming and so bleak. Over 1 million cases worldwide, and the virus has killed more than 8,500 in the United States alone. Last Sunday, the U.S. death toll was around 2,000. The week before, just over 300. As the crisis worsens, the president is also taking advantage of a distracted nation, choosing this moment to fire the Inspector General of the Intelligence Committee, who notified Congress about the whistleblower complaint that led to the president's impeachment. Saturday, the president announced that the military is, quote, going to war to help the states, sending 1,000 U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy medical providers to New York over the next 3 days. Joining us now, the Defense Secretary, Mark Esper. Secretary Esper, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it. You're sending more
And I will have a good clip of Jake Tapper cross-examining the Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, about the firing of the captain of the Teddy Roosevelt, this aircraft carrier who sent out a letter of alarm to several people about the COVID-19 outbreak on the aircraft carrier in a way that probably saved the lives of some of his crew. And that's actually that's not coming up until clip 12. If you're following along on my clip list, there's a link down in the video description to a PDF of my clip list if you want to follow along. But I do have 3 more news summaries I want to show you. The next 2, ABC News' This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and then CBS News' Face the Nation. One thing they do that I like is they really focus on the virus hotspots in the United States and then the new hotspots where, that's looking into the future. They don't do what Meet the Press did and do all the accountability. And I can't remember which one. I think one more of these does have something about the firing of the Intelligence Inspector General Michael Atkinson. I'm not sure about that. But all 4 of these first 4 news summaries are really good journalistic news summaries in various different ways, unlike the Fox News Sunday Trump TV news summary that I'll show you in the 5th spot, which, as usual, is biased towards the Trump administration. Oh, and one way it's biased is that Fox News doesn't do any scary graphics, and all of these have like graphs or maps that are scary in some way or another. And that is also true of this ABC News This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary that if you also talks about this being possibly the worst week of the pandemic in the United States coming up. We don't know if that's a prediction, not a fact, but it looks like we're going into the worst weeks for deaths in the next 1, 2, 3 weeks, and maybe that's going to be the word. Hopefully that's as long as it will take. Anyway, spiking of the hot spots, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that news summary together over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. As we come on the air this morning, the country now braced for what could be the toughest week yet in this crisis. COVID-19 cases continue to climb here, now more than 300,000. More than 8,500 Americans have died. The hottest spots now in the Northeast. New York, the epicenter. More than 63,000 cases in New York City, almost double that across the state. Governor Cuomo warns the peak is coming in the next 7 days and, quote, we are not yet ready for the apex. In New Jersey, the death toll has climbed past 800, well past the number of its citizens killed in the 9/11 attack. And administration officials are now warning of new hotspots: Pennsylvania, Colorado, Washington, D.C., along with Detroit and Louisiana. Quote, there will be a lot of death, President Trump warned at his Saturday press conference. But he also mused about allowing Easter services to go forward next Sunday, pushed hard to reopen the country as soon as possible, and veered into politics with a mix of attacks and praise for his chief rival.
I think the probable presidential candidate for the Democrats will be Joe Biden. And he agreed that I was correct when I stopped people from China very early, very, very early, from coming into our country. And so I appreciate the fact that he did, because I was called xenophobic, racist. I was called many things when I did that very early.
And former Vice President
And I will have the last two news clips I'm going to show you. Clip 15 and 16 are Joe Biden clips from ABC News' This Week with George Stephanopoulos, responding to some of that you just saw in the news summary from ABC, which did do a little bit of accountability on the mixed messaging from Donald Trump, at least, and then veered off into focusing heavily on what he said about Joe Biden, because they had the exclusive Joe Biden guest. That's, you know, one of the corporate news media biases isn't political bias. They have a bias for sensationalism. They have a bias for simplistic analysis. They have a bias for two-sidism, you know, both-sidism, rather than talking about what's true. And they have also a bias for who their exclusive guest is for promoting. Their news summaries tend to skew towards exclusive guests, and Biden is the exclusive guest on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and so I thought I would point out that bias. And another bias that you'll see in, well, CBS News' Face the Nation has another good news summary. Talking first, Margaret Brennan has some good graphics that, like I said, you won't see in the Fox News Sunday news summary, but you saw in pretty much all the other ones. I think all the other ones had graphs or maps or something that really visually showed you the growth of the virus that you won't see in the Fox News Sunday news summary. Although one thing I thought Face the Nation did, and this, it's just because some of it is pre-recorded. They're showing news that isn't news anymore, at least when I watch it on the West Coast. One of the things that happened in New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's news conference this morning is he talked about how New York may actually be at its apex or plateau right now. The data, there aren't enough days of data to be sure, but if it's true, then New York may never need the 30,000 ventilators. They may not need, and they certainly look like they're not going to need the number of hospital beds. I mean, one day does not make a trend, and that's one of the things. You need like multiple days of data to be sure that this is true, but that seemed to be one of the things that Andrew Cuomo was saying might be true in his news conference this morning, and then Donald Trump echoed that in his news conference that he did this afternoon that came after all the news summaries. But you'll see on CBS News' Face the Nation, they emphasize what Andrew Cuomo has been saying all week, but he hedged on this morning that the peak in New York is coming up like a week from now, and they're probably going to be overwhelmed. That's been what they've been saying all week, and today was the first day that maybe that might not be true based on the data, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that CBS News Face the Nation news summary, first from Margaret Brennan and then going over to Mark Strassman in Atlanta. They actually had I've talked about this before. CBS News Face the Nation usually doesn't do any news summary. And now they're doing one from Margaret, Brennan, and then a couple reporters. First, the Mark Strassman one that I'm going to show you the clip of most of the way through. I'm not showing the Elizabeth Palmer one from London, which did extensive reporting on what's going on in the rest of the world, and especially in the UK. I know I have several viewers in the UK where there was breaking news today that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, went into the hospital. That's not good news, although they say, just precautionary. But, what else are they going to say? They wouldn't put him in the hospital if they didn't have to. And that is not good news for Boris Johnson, although still not, terminal news or anything, but it's just not good news. And you can, as I pointed out most weeks, if you go to the Face the Nation link I put down in the video description, it leads to the Face the Nation YouTube channel where almost the entire show is split into segments. So look for the Elizabeth Palmer report on what's going on in the rest of the world from London, where they also talk about I don't think they do a good enough job fact-checking the numbers out of China, but I do want to show the parts that I took a clip of, which is Margaret Brennan's introduction with good graphics, and then this news summary from Mark Strassman, which may not have the latest news on what's happening in New York, as I will discuss with you after we watch that second to last penultimate news summary together over here.
Welcome to Face the Nation. Since last week's broadcast, the number of deaths due to COVID-19 in the U.S. has quadrupled. In the last 24 hours, there have been more than 1,300 new deaths recorded. The hardest hit areas are by now familiar to you: the Northeast, the West Coast, the South, and some parts of the Midwest, with New York City, Los Angeles, New Orleans, and Detroit heavily impacted. Experts say there is a new wave of so-called hotspots coming, expanding areas in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and South, plus states like Indiana and Colorado. CBS News national correspondent Mark Strassman reports from Atlanta.
Good morning, Margaret. The CDC now recommends wearing face masks in public, something cloth like this bandana, all voluntary. It's the latest shift in our crisis lifestyle. Roughly 95% of Americans now live under orders to stay home, a nation in hibernation.
50 states, 50 front lines. And by far, New York has the worst of America's corona contagion.
All these patients here.
40% of the country's cases and almost half the deaths.
We're not yet at the apex, and if we don't stop the spread, then it's going to burn down our own country.
Governor Cuomo believes New York City is about a week away from the apex. Terrible timing. City hospitals could run out of ventilators within days.
And I stopped that there because that is not the most up-to-date messaging out of New York and what Governor Cuomo is saying. I put a link down in the video description to the New York Governor Cuomo channel on YouTube, where you can see his whole briefing from this morning. And like I said, one day is not a trend, but based on the last few days' data, Governor Cuomo saying that maybe the number of deaths has plateaued, but they won't really know for sure till like next week, looking back on this week, if this week was the plateau, which would be really good news for New York, that it didn't go as high as some of the estimates were saying. But I guess by the time I do my show next week, you will know a lot more about that. And I'll have watched, I've been watching all of Andrew Cuomo's news conferences, all of Donald Trump's news conferences, and most of Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, does a daily news conference as well that's covered on my local news. And we've done a pretty good job here in California. They did a pretty good job in Washington State. New York is having a larger problem, although I don't necessarily think that's Andrew Cuomo's fault. Although, you'll see when I get to those those newsmaker clips and explore this issue of the Trump narrative that it's the state's fault and not the federal government's fault, and he blames certain states for, if they have a lot of deaths, it's because they didn't do a good job. The governors didn't do a good job, and I don't think that's really accurate for reasons I'll talk about when I get to those clips. But I have one more news summary, and this is the more politically biased Fox News Sunday news summary. Even though Fox News Sunday is one of the more straight news programs, and Chris Wallace is supposedly a straight news anchor, you'll see here that they don't have the scary graphics. And when they switch over to Mark Meredith, the clips of the Trump news conference don't show how emotionally disturbed. I don't know how to describe his emotional affect, the way he the way he goes back and forth with the reporters and attacks them, and latches on to certain types of misinformation or happy talk. And you'll see there is happy talk covered in this news summary as well, which is not news. The possible cures and treatments, including hydroxychloroquine, which Trump seems to say over and over again, and may end up being actually effective, but the evidence isn't there, certainly not to support what Trump is saying. And, well, anyway, I think I've introduced the Fox News Sunday news summary enough, and I will talk about it a little more after we watch that clip, which has, some of the bad facts in it, but just not as bad as it should be, which I will discuss with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. There are now more than 300,000 cases of coronavirus here in the U.S., and deaths from the virus increased by more than 1,300 in just the last 24 hours. But President Trump says the country must prepare for even worse with this warning.
This will be probably the toughest week between this week and next week, and there'll be a lot of death, unfortunately.
Here are the latest developments. 41 states and the District of Columbia now issuing stay-at-home orders, and new guidance from the CDC encouraging people to wear a face mask outside, even though President Trump says he won't. In a moment, we'll speak with the Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams. But first, let's bring in Mark Meredith, reporting from the White House, with the latest from the front lines. Mark.
Chris, the president's task force says it's focused on places like Detroit, Chicago, and New Orleans, cities where COVID-19 cases are on the rise. And the president is ordering at least 1,000 military medical personnel to New York to fight the virus.
Every day when I go to work, I feel like a sheep going to slaughter.
Protect nurses! America's medical community faces a grim reality. As the coronavirus spreads nationwide, many fear there's not enough equipment, staff, or supplies to save lives.
We are demanding from this hospital the protections that we need.
New York's governor says he's shifting resources to help hospitals most in need.
I'm not going to let people die because we didn't redistribute ventilators. The National Guard are going to be deployed to pick up these ventilators, which are all across the state, and deploy them to places where we need them.
In New York State alone, at least 3,500 people have died, and the president says the worst is yet to come.
We're getting to that point where it's going to really be some very bad numbers.
The government is increasing its supply of hydroxychloroquine, a drug normally used to treat malaria, but health experts stress there's no guarantee the drug will save lives.
It is definitely overwhelming to know that in my blood there may be answers.
People once infected are now helping researchers test treatments. The FDA is examining the use of plasma from recovered patients to treat the sick. The CDC is now urging Americans to use a cloth face mask while out in the public, but the president said on Friday, Chris, he does not plan to use one himself. Chris?
Mark Meredith reporting from the White House. Mark, thanks.
And that last part there from Mark Meredith, that is what passes for criticism of the president on Fox News, even their supposedly straight news programs, where Trump says he won't wear a mask, even though his Surgeon General is recommending, or the CDC is recommending. And I'm going to show you the Surgeon General. Actually, the next two clips are of the Surgeon General, and one actual journalistic cross-examination from Chris Wallace, the supposedly straight news anchor of Fox News Sunday. That's actually the next clip. In fact, the next two clips are both the Surgeon General Jerome Adams answering questions. The first one's from Fox News Sunday, then the next one's from from Chuck Todd on NBC News' Meet the Press. But first, here's Chris Wallace first getting the Surgeon General to say that we're coming up on the worst week. You'll see his question here. I wanted to point out that I criticized Fox News Sunday in their news summary for not showing any scary graphics, no like maps with old hot zones and new hot zones like the two previous news summaries, or all where the numbers of deaths, or the graphs, the bar graphs, or line graphs, or anything. And the closest you get is in this next questioning from Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday, talking to the Surgeon General Jerome Adams, where he does show a line graph showing the U.S. has a really bad graph, and he asks the Surgeon General about that and gets the answer that this next week is going to be our Pearl Harbor, our 9/11. This is going to be the worst week, according to the Surgeon General. And he said this on a couple different programs, including Meet the Press, not in the clip that I took. But and then Chris Wallace actually follows up about why the president hasn't told all the states to go on stay-at-home orders. We're only up to 90%. We should really be at 100%. And you'll see that the Surgeon General kind of dodges that question, and I will talk about that a little more after we watch about 4 minutes and 22 seconds of Chris Wallace kind of acting like a journalist, a straight news anchor of a program, even though it's on Trump TV. If you want to know more about why it's Trump TV, read this book over here, The Loudest Voice in the Room, by Gabriel Sherman, but I won't go into that. That would be a big tangent. I will instead show you the Surgeon General of the United States saying this is going to be the week of Pearl Harbor and 9/11 for the United States. And I'll talk about that a little more with you after we watch it together over here.
Dr. Adams, the U.S. is now reporting 30,000 new cases a day. And I want to put up a chart that shows the curve of cases in Italy and China, which have leveled off and are now going down, and the curve on the far right there here in the U.S., which is still in the early stages and still headed up sharply. Given the course of the disease in China and Italy, and that we are weeks or months behind them, how bad is this epidemic going to be in America, and how long will it last?
Well, it's tragically fitting that we're talking at the beginning of Holy Week, because this is going to be the hardest and the saddest week of most Americans' lives, quite frankly. This is going to be our Pearl Harbor moment, our 9/11 moment, only it's not going to be localized. It's going to be happening all over the country, and I want America to understand that. But I also want them to understand that the public, along with the state and the federal government, have the power to change the trajectory of this epidemic. You mentioned Italy and Spain. They had a very, very hard time, and they're still having a hard time, but they seem to have reached their peak and are coming back down on the other side. And you say weeks, months behind. I would actually push back a little bit. When you look at their trajectory, from about a month ago is when they really started to lean into their aggressive mitigation efforts, their really aggressive mitigation efforts. And so I want Americans to understand that as hard as this week is going to be, there is a light at the end of the tunnel if everyone does their part for the next 30 days. We're seeing Washington, actually where this started, doing a much better job. California's trajectory has leveled off. And so there is hope, but we've got to all do our part.
Let's talk about mitigation, because the president's top health advisors, including you, say the most important thing we can do, all of us, is to stay at home. And yet there are still 9 states There are still 9 states with millions of Americans that still have not issued stay-at-home orders. President Trump was asked about that this week. Here he is.
I leave it up to the governors. The governors know what they're doing. They've been doing a great job. I guess we're close to 90% anyway. And states that we're talking about are not in jeopardy. No, I would leave it to the governors.
But Dr. Adams, the coronavirus is not a state issue. It doesn't follow or respect state borders. Dr. Fauci says he believes that there should be a national stay-at-home order. Is he wrong?
Well, Chris, it's important to understand that most people across the country are doing the right thing. Over 90% of the country is staying at home, and a good proportion, more than average, are staying home even in those 9 states. But the last time you and I talked, it was about opioids. People don't know, but I've run a state Department of Health. I've been involved in health for years, and diseases don't respect state lines, but we live in a country where we have a system of federalism. And when it comes to opioids, states have different rules and regulations and laws regarding treatment, regarding syringe service programs, as you and I have talked about. I actually put out a report on tobacco cessation earlier this year, and we know that states have different laws there, and more people will die, even in the worst projections, from cigarette smoking in this country than are going to die from coronavirus this year. And so we always are struggling with trying to get information out to guide people that we know will help them be healthy with states' rights. But it's why we put out these 30 days to stop the spread guidelines. These are essentially our national stay-at-home order, and we're working with governors to figure out their needs, their desires. One more important point, the 9 states that haven't yet done shelter-in-place orders are states that actually produce a large amount of our food. So they're struggling with issues concerning how they can provide for the rest of the country to be able to stay at home. But right now, what I would say to those governors is, if you can't give us a month, give us what you can. Give us a week. Give us whatever you can to stay at home during this particularly tough time when we're going to be hitting our peak over the next 7 to 10 days.
But Doctor.
So at least the U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Adams there was trying to give the good recommendation to governors that they, even if you can't give us a month, give us a week. This is going to be the worst week, and this is the week to give us. And he's giving a national stay-at-home recommendation. And honestly, legally, I don't know if the federal government could actually enforce a national stay-at-home order, but that should definitely be my point isn't that there should be, federal troops out there enforcing a national stay-at-home order or whatever. It's that should be the messaging from the federal government, from Donald Trump to the governors. It's more the bully pulpit than the coercive power of the state, which I think might be legally questionable, because as I talked about a couple weeks ago, the police power, if you look at your Constitution, our federal government is made up of powers delegated to it by the states, and the states keep those powers not delegated. And traditionally and constitutionally, according to constitutional law, one of the powers that the state keeps to itself, except in limited amounts, is the police power, the power to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens. And actually, the federal government has usurped the police power more and more over the centuries since this Constitution was written, and that's why there's so many federal criminal laws, and the FBI and the Justice Department and Department of Homeland Security. That's all like growth of the federal government. But basically, the plenary power, police power, is still at the state level. But that doesn't mean that you can't have good leadership from the federal government, telling all the governors, telling all the states, it's time for everyone to stay home except for essential workers. And that's kind of what the Surgeon General was trying to say there, without contradicting his, I don't know what the mental or emotional instability, I guess malignant narcissistic boss of the Surgeon General is having these mixed messages and trying to support the red state rural Republican governors and not shutting things down and maybe even letting people get together for Palm Sunday and Easter. And that actually happened at a church around where I live, where a pastor wouldn't tell his congregation not to show up this week. And I didn't want to get into all that, but I do want to show one more clip of the U.S. Surgeon General not just saying what you heard him say in response to Chris Wallace's somewhat journalistic cross-examination, but in this clip, Chuck Todd on NBC News' Meet the Press talks about this new recommendation to wear masks. You may remember that a few weeks ago I started off my program wearing one of these masks. I actually serendipitously bought a pack of 10 masks at my local grocery store months ago because I have to use this carpet cleaner thing to clean up the dog and cat urine on our carpet, which seems to be like a weekly battle and really gross. And when you run the cleaner, it creates this dust and fumes that I like to wear the mask. And so I happen to have these, and they're gold now. They're gold. This is going to get me through the zombie apocalypse. No, I don't know. But that's the new recommendation. And when I wore this mask on the show, in the beginning of the show, like 4 weeks ago or something, I then immediately took it off and said, actually it's kind of bogus because this doesn't protect you from the virus. The only thing it really does is it protects other people if you have the virus. And the virus has gotten so bad, or we don't even really know because of lack of testing. But the point is that so many people may have the virus and may be spreading it that, especially in the hot spots, but maybe all over, they're saying it might be worthwhile to wear these masks, but it's not a substitute for social distancing. That's a really important point that you'll hear the Surgeon General make in this clip, and it's important to remember when I contrast it with what the Republican governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson, says, talking to Chuck Todd later in the program. So keep that in mind watching this Jerome Adams clip that I will talk about with you a little more. I won't put this mask on, but he'll put a mask on during this clip, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
And let me start with, you're the Surgeon General. Give us your recommendation on face masks.
Well, it's important for America to understand that originally the CDC, the World Health Organization, and my office all recommended against the public wearing face masks because the best available evidence at the time suggested that they were not impactful in preventing you from catching a disease if you were the individual wearer and you were healthy. We always recommended that if people had symptoms, that they wear a face mask to prevent spreading disease to other folks. Here's what's changed. We now know that about 25%, in some studies even more, of COVID-19 is transmitted when you are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. And so the CDC has now recommended that people wear cloth face coverings when they're going to be out in public and they can't be more than 6 feet away from each other. But here are the important points really quickly. Number one, you need to make sure you're not substituting social distancing with face masks because the most important thing is still to stay away from people. Make sure if you put on a face mask, you don't touch your face and you don't and you wash your hands before you utilize it. And number three, save the medical mask for the healthcare workers. Excuse me, they need them. They absolutely need them to be able to respond. I have a video out where I made a cloth face mask out of a t-shirt.
Yeah.
And rubber bands. Anyone can do this. We all need to do our part to get through this.
So there you see the Surgeon General explaining the change in policy on face masks, which the kind of face masks that he's talking about that you can make yourself, and he even made a video showing how you can make them. They don't really protect you from the virus, but they protect other people from you giving them the virus. They keep your droplets in. They don't keep other people's droplets out. They keep your own droplets in. That's the point of the masks. And you noticed, if you were paying attention, like I said before I showed the clip, he said they are not a substitute for social distancing. And I tried to show you it. You saw that he also modeled, not that he was into models like Donald Trump in the joke I showed at the beginning. He did what Donald Trump wouldn't do. Donald Trump won't wear the mask because he doesn't want to look silly when he meets with dictators and potentates and kings and queens, or whatever he said on Friday when he said he wouldn't wear a mask. But you see, the Surgeon General wasn't afraid to look silly wearing a mask. And then actually at the very end of his interview, he put the mask on again. And I tried to get that at the beginning of this clip, which I missed. But you'll see Jerome Adams again briefly at the beginning of this clip, which then goes into two governors, the Democratic governor of Washington, Jay Inslee, and I don't have a clip from him, but then Asa Hutchinson, one of the 9 governors who refuses to do one of these stay-at-home orders, and he justifies it kind of ridiculously, I think, and especially saying that he's doing what the Surgeon General said and more, because he's using masks, and he keeps talking about the masks and how he's using prisoners to make masks, but he isn't really paying attention to what the Surgeon General said about masks not being a substitute for social distancing. Instead, he is saying that they are a substitute for social distancing. If you pay attention to Republican Governor Asa Hutchinson from Arkansas in this clip.
Thank you, Chuck.
All right. Thank you, sir. And joining me now are 2 governors who have taken very different steps in the face of the coronavirus pandemic. It's Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State, the first state to be hit hard. And it's Asa Hutchinson of Arkansas, one of the few governors who has not issued a stay-at-home order. Gentlemen, welcome back to Meet the Press for both of you. Governor Hutchinson, I want to start with you. You heard the Surgeon General there. He's pleading, give him a week. He'd prefer, if it for all 30 days of this month. Your response to the Surgeon General?
Great comments by the Surgeon General in Arkansas. We're doing everything that the Surgeon General has outlined, plus more. For example, I applaud the recommendations on masks. Yesterday, we issued guidelines that if you go out, social distance first of all, but bring a mask with you in case you get in environments you cannot have that 6 feet spread. In Arkansas, we have a targeted approach that is very strict. We've closed bars, restaurants, schools, some of our park lodges. We're emphasizing the social distancing, and we will do more as we need to. But let me give you an example of why the masks are so important. And by the way, we have had success in Arkansas comparable to other states, in fact, beating and slowing the spread more than in some states that have actually had a stay-at-home order. But you have a stay-at-home order, tomorrow 600,000 Arkansans will still go to work. So it's more important in the message that do your social distancing, don't gather in groups of more than 10 people, and bring a mask with you. I'm going to be following that instruction. If I can't social distance, I want to have a mask on. We just had last night a breakout in one of our federal prisons here in Arkansas that have 10 inmates that tested positive and 4 guards. That's a federal facility, but stay at home doesn't help there. You've got to have the mask, and our state prison is producing masks that we could utilize in our state prison environment. Those are some of the things that we're doing. We'll do more as we need to, listening to our public health officials.
All right. Governor Inslee.
I don't know, was the governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson, there using the mask issue to mask the real issues, like especially the spread of coronavirus in the federal prison in Arkansas? But we're having them make masks, and we're going to use masks if we can't engage in social distancing, even though if you watched, like I said, Jerome Adams in the previous clip, that he specifically said masks are not a substitute for social distancing. So I don't know. There's some conspiracy theories that the Trump administration is hoarding various supplies to send them to red states when they get problems, so that the red states look better than the blue states, and that I mean, I don't know if there's anything behind some of those. Oh, Dash and Sandy right there together. Should I try to get a Dash and Sandy clip? I already had a Dash and Sandy clip, but oh, too late. Sandy walked away, but I had Dash and Sandy right over there to my left. But I have a Dash and Sandy clip for you at the end. But that distracted me from this important point that Trump is not only possibly moving around supplies to make the red states look better than the blue states, but he's also, that's kind of just conjecture, but what's not conjecture is this narrative that Trump has been putting out there for at least this last week and even longer, that if anything bad happens, it's not his responsibility. In fact, you can blame those governors. And the next two governors are governors who he's specifically trying to blame. The first one is Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, and the next one is J.B. Pritzker of Illinois, who I guess because he criticized Trump in the clip I'm going to show you, Pritzker got attacked by Trump in his news conference this afternoon after these clips, or after the news analysis shows on the corporate outlets this morning. But first I want to show Gretchen Whitmer, who has been attacked by Trump personally. In one tweet that I think he actually deleted, he called her Gretchen half Whitmer, you know, half Whitmer, you get it? And also referred to her as that woman in Michigan, because he doesn't like getting criticized by women. That's one of the things we know about Donald Trump. And one of the things I really like about this clip is if you pay attention, most of this clip, Gretchen Whitmer is saying that she is grateful for federal help and we all have to work together. And then somewhere in the middle, she hides this, well, not really hides, but she subtly slips in this idea that the Trump administration's decisions are killing people. And one of the things that Joe Biden said this week, or was reported this week, is that Joe Biden is considering Gretchen Whitmer as a possible vice presidential candidate, since Joe Biden is most likely going to be the nominee, and he's pledged to nominate a woman. So watch that this clip with that in mind, and I will discuss that a little more with you after we watch the clip together over here.
Michigan businesses ramping up production.
President Trump says that the federal government, the national stockpile, is the second line of defense, that it's basically up to the states to prepare for these emergencies. Here he is on that.
The states should be building. We're a backup. We're not an ordering clerk. We're a backup. And we've done an unbelievable job.
And the feds, the president said yesterday, just sent 300 ventilators to Michigan. So does the president have a point about where the prime responsibility here lies?
Well, let me start with this. I'm grateful for the help that we've gotten. This 300 ventilators will save 300 lives, maybe 600 if we can use one vent for two people like doctors are working on here in Michigan. But I will say this, not having a national strategy where there is one policy for the country as opposed to a patchwork based on whomever the governor is something that I think is creating a more porous situation where COVID-19 will go longer and more people will get sick, and sadly more lives may get lost. And that's precisely why I think we all have to do our jobs. We are not one another's enemy. The enemy is COVID-19, and it has to be all hands on deck from the federal level to the state level to the local level. And that's precisely what we're trying to do, because COVID-19, as I said, doesn't discriminate on party line or state line, and that's why we have to have a national strategy, and we all have to be working on the same team.
I want to pick up on that in a second.
So, like I said, in the middle of the grateful for federal assistance and we all got to work together and the real enemy is the coronavirus, Gretchen Whitmer did slip in Trump's decisions are killing Americans, but I thought that was pretty, I mean, it's not as grotesque as what you see in the Trump press conference reality shows, but do you think that is vice presidential material? You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. And I have one more governor for you before I get to well, I have the Secretary of Defense talking about the firing of this aircraft carrier captain that I promised earlier, and then a couple Anthony Fauci clips and a couple Joe Biden clips before I finish the show with the Dash and Sandy clip. Sandy's back here, but who knows where Dash is. And Anyway, this is J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, responding to Jake Tapper, showing him a clip of Trump specifically blaming the states, setting up this narrative that the federal government is the backup for the states that haven't done their jobs. And I think J.B. Pritzker also has a good response that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
President Trump said yesterday that everyone needed to, quote, stop playing this game with governors about allocating medical equipment from the federal government. And then I want you to take a listen to what the president said on Friday about the Trump administration's new line of argument about the federal stockpile of medical supplies and devices.
We have a federal stockpile and they have state stockpiles. And frankly, many of the states were totally unprepared for this. So we had to go into the federal stockpile. But we're not an ordering clerk. They have to have for themselves.
What's your reaction, Governor?
Well, the president does not understand the word federal emergency management agency. We have a state emergency management agency, but if he were right, why would we ever need a federal emergency management agency? It's because individual states can't possibly do what the federal government can do. We don't have a Defense Production Act. There's no way that we could stockpile in anticipation of a pandemic that no one anticipated, and yet the federal government is responsible for doing precisely that. And we now know that intelligence sources and all the best advice that was given in January and early February to the president and the White House, and they seem not to have acted at all upon it. If they had started in February building ventilators, getting ready for this pandemic, we would not have the problems that we have today, and frankly, very many fewer people would die.
There are 8 states that have not yet enacted a stay-at-home.
Jake Tapper said 8 states there. Earlier, Chris Wallace said 9 states. I don't know why there's that discrepancy. I tend to believe Jake Tapper over Chris Wallace, CNN over Fox News, but I don't know why there's that discrepancy. But as to the number of states that don't have stay-at-home orders, but I couldn't agree more with what J.B. Pritzker said there in terms of, does Trump even know what the word federal means? And like I said earlier, I thought the NBC News Meet the Press news summary did the best job of showing how the federal government is trying to scrub the purpose of the federal stockpile as now just a backup to the states, not like the depository for to meet multiple emergencies in multiple states. And it's more Trump trying to avoid responsibility. And like I said, his latest narrative is blaming the states. And that's why I wanted to show you those Democratic governors in their own ways responding to that critique. And now the next clip I want to show you is on sort of a different topic. Over my shoulder here, I have this Mr. Spock mug because, as you know, I'm a big Star Trek fan. I've watched all the Star Trek episodes, even just recently finished watching Picard. And one of the ethoses, is that a word? Ethoses? There's this ethos that I picked up from the Star Trek series and maybe from other sources in terms of the military ethic, the commander being really concerned about his troops. And this story about this commander of this aircraft carrier, the Teddy Roosevelt, Commander Crozier, there was this clip of him leaving. He was fired because he sent this letter that became public saying that the big brass were not paying attention to the needs of his soldiers or his, I guess, his seamen, the crew of his aircraft carrier. And it just reminded me of the kind of thing that like Captain Kirk or maybe even Captain Picard might do, where they give up their career to protect the safety of the crew. And here you'll see Jake Tapper doing a really strong cross-examination of the Secretary of Defense about, why he was fired without investigation. You'll hear the Secretary of Defense saying, well, we fired him, but we're still investigating, when Jake Tapper is a little bit incredulous about that. And also about, he mentions the various other command. He doesn't mention the people who Trump has pardoned or intervened in military justice to allow people who are war criminals or about to be convicted of war crimes or alleged war criminals or whatever. Those people Trump fights for, but this commander protecting his troops in, the way that you want maybe a commander to do, at least based on, I have a few different sources of getting my military ethos, even though I never served in the military. It's not just Star Trek. I also, my father was in the military for a few years when I was growing up, and I lived on a military base in my very young formative years. And then I also spent a lot of time studying military history, getting my undergraduate degree in history, which involves a lot of reading of the thoughts of military leaders. I actually had a seminar. This is when I was an undergraduate at Yale, a seminar in grand strategy where people from the Naval War College came and spoke to us. And so I did pick up a little bit of the military ethos from there. And I just think what Trump is doing is not good for military morale, not good for what a commander is supposed to be from the commander-in-chief. And Jake Tapper, by the end of this clip, you'll see also sort of delves into whether Trump intervened in the wrong way, whether it was his decision or his acting Secretary of the Navy. Remember, he already got rid of the Secretary of the Navy because of the whole pardoning of the Navy SEAL debacle. And that's why he has an acting secretary who, is doing his bidding, because that's why he's the acting Secretary of the Navy. And I think it's not right for reasons I will discuss a little more after we watch that cross-examination from Jake Tapper over here.
The captain of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, Captain Brett Crozier, was relieved of his command on Thursday after he wrote a memo that expressed his dire concerns about the more than 100 infected sailors in a coronavirus outbreak on his ship, and whether or not those individuals would spread the virus to the thousands of sailors also on the ship. I want you to take a look at this video of Captain Crozier leaving the ship to cheers from his fellow sailors. So, Secretary Esper, can you explain to those sailors cheering Captain Crozier, why exactly he was relieved of his command?
Well, Jake, first and foremost, we need to take care of the sailors on the ship. We need to ensure their well-being and get that ship back out to sea as soon as possible. I'm pleased to report right now over half of the ship has been tested. Only 155 sailors have come up positive. Those are all mild and moderate. There have been no hospitalizations whatsoever. So the crew is being taken care of out there. With regard to the relief of Captain Crozier, I think Acting Secretary Modly made a very tough decision, a decision that I support. It was based on his view that he had lost faith and confidence in the captain based on his actions. It was supported by Navy leadership. And I think it's just another example how we hold leaders accountable for their actions.
Shouldn't there have been at least an investigation before he was relieved of command? I mean, the captains of the USS John McCain and the USS Fitzgerald, who were captains when sailors died at sea, they at least had investigations before they were relieved of their commands. Captain Crozier was trying to save lives, and he wasn't even afforded the benefit of an investigation.
Well, there is an investigation ongoing, but at this point in time, the Secretary Modly did not have faith and confidence that he could continue in his role as captain of the ship. That is not unheard of. All the services at time relieve commanders without the benefit of an investigation up front because they've lost confidence in them. It's certainly not unique to the Navy. The Navy has a culture of swiftly and decisively removing captains if they lose confidence in them.
You know, there are a number of noted high-ranking former officials like Admiral Mullen, who was former chair of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Stavridis, who was former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, both of whom have said they did not think it was appropriate for Crozier to have been relieved of duty so quickly without an investigation, and that it would undermine morale. On the other hand, of course, you had President Trump, who said that he thought it was not appropriate for Crozier to even write the letter. Take a listen.
I thought it was terrible what he did, to write a letter. I mean, this isn't a class on literature. He shouldn't be talking that way in a letter. He could call and ask and suggest.
He wrote a letter to try to save the lives of his sailors. Do you think that's terrible that he did that?
Well, Jake, I can't get too much into the facts of the matter because there is an investigation ongoing. This could ultimately come to my desk. I think Secretary Moodley laid out very reasonably, very deliberately, the reasons why. And I think when all those facts come to bear, we'll have a chance to understand why Secretary Moodley did what he did.
Acting Navy Secretary Mobley reportedly told a colleague on Wednesday, quote, breaking news, Trump wants him fired. Did ultimately this decision, was it made by President Trump?
This was Secretary Mobley's decision. He briefed me about it, and I took the advice of the CNO and General Milley with regard to it, and I told him I would support his decision.
I want to ask you about the sailors because you mentioned.
Now, he said it was the acting secretary's decision, but he didn't say whether it was influenced by anything that came from Donald Trump, the commander-in-chief, and he said he didn't want to comment too much because he's in the chain of command, but of course Trump commented, and he is the top of the chain of command, so there's a lot of problems in that whole thing that I mostly talked about before I showed the clip. And now I have 4 more clips, 2 Anthony Fauci clips, 2 Joe Biden clips, and then, of course, the bonus Dash and Sandy clip, or Dandy clip, as some people like to call it. Anthony Fauci and Joe Biden are the 2 newsmakers who I put in my title, so maybe these are the most important clips. First, here I have 2 clips of Anthony Fauci Two clips of Anthony Fauci answering questions from Margaret Brennan on CBS News' Face the Nation. I thought both of these were important. The first clip you'll see is, there are many clips that Trump is going to be responsible for in the coming months as he's running for president. And the last 2 clips I'm going to show are Joe Biden where I think he's doing a better job of holding Trump accountable for his bad decisions. But one of his bad decisions or bad pieces of rhetoric was all the times he and his administration said they had this under control. And you'll see here, well, first you'll see Anthony Fauci talking about how these are like the worst weeks coming up. And then Margaret Brennan asking, do you have the virus under, is mitigation working? Is it under control? And he'll say it would be false to say it was under control, which is something Trump and like Larry Kudlow said multiple times over weeks in the past. So he's contradicting his boss there. And then also talking about the time lag between when mitigation is working, but then when the actual deaths start coming down. And I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Mitigate, continue to do the physical separation, because we got to get through this week that's coming up, because it is going to be a bad week.
Are you saying, doctor, that despite the deaths that we may see, that mitigation is working and that you do have this outbreak under control?
I will not say we have it under control, Margaret. That would be a false statement. We are struggling to get it under control, and that's the issue that's at hand right now. The thing that's important is that what you see is increases in new cases, which then start to flatten out. But the end result of that you don't see for days, if not weeks, down the pike, because as the cases go down, then you get less hospitalizations, less intensive care, and less death. So even though you're getting a really improvement in that the number of new cases are starting to flatten, the deaths will lag by 1 or 2 weeks or more. So we need to be prepared that even though it's clear that mitigation is working, we're still going to see that tail off of deaths. So the first thing we want to look for is to see on a daily basis are the number of new cases starting to stabilize. We've seen that in Italy. You just mentioned that correctly. We're going to hopefully be seeing that in New York very soon. And that's the first sign of that plateau and coming down.
So when Governor Cuomo says New York is not yet at the apex, what does that actually mean? And what happens on the other?
And there you see again the problem with Face the Nation not having watched Andrew Cuomo's news conference from this morning, where he says they may be at the apex. But of course, one day's worth of data is not a trend, so it's going to take at least a few days and maybe a week before we actually know if New York is at the apex. But that was, somewhat good questioning by Margaret Brennan. But I think this next question from Margaret Brennan is the best question I've seen asked of Anthony Fauci in multiple weeks here, where she points out the three things that we're going to need to get the country back to work, as Trump keeps saying he wants to do. And it's we need to have robust testing. We're still way, way behind on testing. They've been promising all these tests for weeks and weeks, and we're still not up to snuff on that. And so we have to, in order to get people back to work, we have to be able to do like universal testing and then isolate the people who are positive and even do contact tracing, especially if we want to go back to work and there's like a seasonal recurrence of the coronavirus in the fall. And you'll see here that Anthony Fauci actually never answers the when question. He just says, we're working on it, it's coming, and it's getting better, but testing isn't there yet still, as I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
That we're in right now.
So you said yesterday that there are three things you think this country needs to have in place before some of these restrictions are pulled back. The ability to test, to isolate, and to do contact tracing. How close are we to meeting those requirements you laid out?
We're not 100% there yet, but the people who are responsible for getting these tests out there, it's very clear that we are much, much better off than we were, in the sense that in the next week or two, we'll have an extraordinary amount more capability of doing the kinds of testing that's essential. Because testing is not only important to be able to identify individual cases, isolate them, and contact tracing, but we really do need to get a feel for what the penetrance of this infection is in society. That becomes critical when you plan to start to get back to normal, or at least take those first steps to getting back to normal. You have to know what's out there. You have to know what you're dealing with. So testing becomes even more important than what we've been speaking about in the past.
Do you wear a mask when you're not on television?
And like I said, if you want to see Anthony Fauci's answer to that question, there's a link down in the video description to the Face the Nation channel on YouTube, where all of their segments are, or the entire show is split into segments, including the Anthony Fauci interview, where you can see him say when and why when and where he wears a mask, although he answered that question differently in the news conference with Trump this afternoon, where he said he just tested negative, so he doesn't have to wear a mask because he's not going to be spreading the virus, and that's why people need to wear the mask, as I talked about earlier. But he kind of dodged the question, like I said before I showed the clip, talking about when there's going to be enough testing. Right now there have been, I think it's like 1.6 million Americans tested. And from some of the estimates I've heard, we need the ability to test like 1.5 million Americans per day. Per day. We have to be able to test per day almost the entire amount of Americans so far who have been tested. So we are way behind where we need to be on testing. That's one of testing, as Nancy Pelosi says in a lot of her interviews. That is one of the biggest failures of the Trump administration in their response to this whole pandemic. But on the subject of Trump's failures, I want to show you two clips of Joe Biden criticizing Donald Trump, I think doing a better job than the last Joe Biden clips I showed you. These are both from ABC News' This Week with George Stephanopoulos. In this first clip, He's answering a question about whether he will take a phone call with Donald Trump, and Trump praising him in his news conference, but he still gets in a few digs, and especially at the end, listen to what he says about Trump's biggest boast about how he cut off travel from China, and that's why we're in such good shape here in the United States, even though we're leading the world in cases and soon in deaths, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Sure thing. We just heard President Trump there talking about you at his press conference yesterday, but his team also said this week that he'd be open to taking a phone call from you. Has that phone call happened? And if it does, what's the most important thing you want to tell him to do right now?
Well, it hadn't happened. I'm happy to talk to him, and I just tell him what we found is important to do when we went through not as bad, but a similar crisis, and that is to you have to move swiftly, and we have to move more rapidly. You have to implement the Defense Production Act, empower a supply commander, create a Defense Production Act for banks to get out small business loans, ramp up testing, a whole range of things. You got to go faster than slower, and we started off awfully slow. He indicated that I complimented him on dealing with China. Well, 45 nations had already moved to keep block China's personnel from being able to come to the United States before the president moved. So it's about pace. It's about the urgency, and I don't think there's been enough of it.
There's some weird noise in the background on ABC, but it was all throughout the program. I think it was actually on George Stephanopoulos' side, and you'll hear it again in this next clip, final news clip, where Joe Biden does another good job of listing some of the failures of the Trump administration. Not only, kind of try to think of this as the Trump versus Biden debate. He I think refuted the whole, I was early on China, but there were all these other countries who were earlier on China, and then some of the other failures are listed in the final news clip I want to talk about with you after we watch together over here.
And your campaign videos have been quite tough on the president. You say his failures, his incompetence are going to cost lives. Is that what's happening now?
Well, look, what I have been saying is that he's moving too slow. The virus is not his fault. But the response is his responsibility. Look, there are a few things he can do. He can immediately fully implement the Defense Production Act, which I and many others called for a long time ago, and he's just getting underway with it. There's still no Defense Supply Act, Production Act for gloves, masks, all the things first responders need. We should create a Bank Defense Production Act. We got to get those small business loans out. You saw what American Express did. Bank of America did. They came out and said, unless you already have loans with us, unless you've already worked with us, unless you have a credit card with us, we're not gonna, even though they're government guaranteed loans, we're not gonna process those loans. We got to save jobs. We got to save people's businesses. And they have to exponentially ramp up testing. We've been talking about 4 million tests are going to be available. Look, where's all this? Where is it? What's being done? You got to open up enrollment for Obamacare. A lot of people don't have insurance. This president is trying to take away Obamacare across the board, was leave people naked to this problem that we're facing. And we have to finally get some data how this coronavirus is really hurting African Americans and minority communities. These are things that should be done now, but you need a supply commander in charge of it all, and right out of the White House, right out of the direct response to the president, so we know where to get what we have to get and get it quickly.
Back in 2014, President...
I don't know what that weird, trilling noise is in the background there. I think it's George Stephanopoulos broadcasting from home or something, but I think Joe Biden did a better job there of listing the failures of the Trump administration. Is that enough? The bad economy, along with all of the other Trump failures. I think the bad economy was keeping Trump buoyed in the polls, and he may have a little bit of rallying around the leader effect at this point, but by the time we get to November, when we're going to be in a recession, if not a depression, plus all the other problems that I think that Biden, whatever he does, may have a good chance, and he is showing that he is possibly up to the job, at least better than the previous clips I showed you. And anyway, you can let me know what you think down in the comment section. That was my last news clip. I want to finish the show, but first I want to thank the people who supported the show through the Super Chat contribution feature during the live program. Here's my screen capture of that. So thanks to all those contributors, and happy birthday again to Sexy Bob, and also happy birthday to my mom if she's out there watching somewhere. And I also appreciate my patrons on Patreon who support me monthly. There's a link in the video description to do that. And also the direct PayPal contributors. I just sent out a bunch of stickers and constitutions to those supporters, as I do at the $5 and $10 level. And also there's a join button down below the video if you want to support me financially through any of those venues of doing that. Or this is probably the fourth week in a row that YouTube is going to demonetize my video for talking about coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic, which I guess can't be monetized. But anyway, before I finish the show, I did promise a bonus Dash and Sandy clip. This is Sandy just came back in, but this is Dash and Sandy over by the food and water bowls. And what you may not know about Dash is very vocal, and you will hear a little bit of Dash vocalization in this brief Dash and Sandy clip, or Dandy clip as some people like to call it over here. And there you go. That's the program. I hope you appreciate the 8 to 10 hours I spent this Sunday and every Sunday for the last 363 Sundays, picking out the best clips from the corporate news media and bringing them to you with my political commentary and media criticism. That is my show for tonight, and I will be back next week and every week for the foreseeable future, at least for this year. And until next week, or until I have some other reason to upload a video, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.